My name is Viv Parry, and I'm the co-president of the Child Survivors of the Holocaust group here in Melbourne. I wish to acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. A warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us. We welcome Holocaust survivors, including my dear friend Esther Wise, our child survivors of the Holocaust, their families and friends, and others who've been gracious enough to join us today. I also welcome the Melbourne Holocaust Museum co-president Pauline Rockman, and also MHM board members Mary Slade and all the volunteers. I would like to thank our dedicated and hard-working child survivors of the Holocaust co-president Lena Fishman and MHM CEO Jane Joseph and Alice McInnes and her team for the support for the child survivors. We also welcome online today members of the World Federation Jewish Child Survivors of the Holocaust and their descendants USA and child survivors of the Holocaust New South Wales. This event seeks to illuminate and inform the nature of memory across the generations. Memories can be a blessing or a curse for so many of us, in particular those who have suffered trauma. Memories from our past we fear to think about in the years that followed seem safe locked away, far from the light of day. Out of sight, out of mind, we assumed. Time passes, and with age, we might consider reflecting back on those times we feared to remember, to try to make sense of what happened to us and how the events changed us forever. And in this exploring of our past, we might also reflect on the reactions of those we have tried to speak with, our family members or others we trusted to share what happened to us. The result of those conversations was not always as we had hoped. Now, in our quiet moments, more doubts and questions may arise. I know deep within myself this is what happened to me, but I don't know if my childhood memories are real. Dr. Paul Valent, a child survivor of the Holocaust, psychiatrist and traumatologist, has grappled with his patients' memories as well as his own. Internationally acclaimed author of important writings such as Child Survivors of the Holocaust, In Two Minds, From Survival to Fulfillment, and important papers on the mind, trauma and memory, Paul is our guest speaker. Founding president of the Child Survivors of the Holocaust Melbourne group over 30 years ago, Paul has been a trusted confidant, authority and advisor for so many in our child survivor community. You'll find some of Paul's books available here today. For information on the Holocaust, search Paul's website. We are honoured and privileged to welcome Paul to provide guidance and share his knowledge of the nature of memory across the generations. A Q&A will follow. Please warmly welcome Dr. Paul Valent.
Thank you very much, Viv, and thank you for everyone who's organised this event. We know that the future, well, we know not the future, actually. What we know is the present, which is fleeting. What we really know, in some ways, is the past. And the past is our memories, and we are our memories. In this Holocaust Museum, we are in a world of memories. The past is gathered as historical evidence, so that the future is informed truthfully about the past. But today, we are concerned about subjective memories, and we need to understand them too, because they are actually, I think, at least as important in fashioning future. We're talking about memories. What is the purpose of memory? How reliable are memories? Everyday memories are not carbon copies of reality. We don't recall, for instance, every school day. We fashion a template of average school days. Some memories, like our weddings, stand out, but even there we remember the highlights that we want to preserve as foundational blocks. Most memories we coalesce as a kind of average to help us explain the world to us and to ourselves. Now, traumatic memories are quite different. Their threats are burnt into our memories so that, should cues of their repetition arise, our memories can act immediately to assure survival. In our evolutionary jungle, this worked very well with regard to, say, memories of the Holocaust traumas. There are problems because if we react to cues that evoke the Holocaust, but actually there's no Holocaust at the time, our actions appear to be irrational. Another problem with Holocaust memories is that to recall them can evoke despair, and we might even want to die. But then, on the other hand, obliterating the past would mean not having a self. We will be just shells of human beings. And these are the eternal conflicts of Holocaust survivors, encapsulated by a child survivor, for instance, Ita Van Helen Keller. And she wrote, "I want to remember my past, to see before my eyes the image of my parents, the house in which I grew up, the village in which my family lived for generations. I don't want to remember my past. I fear for what my memory might bring before my eyes. I wonder whether I can continue my life if I'll rescue from oblivion what I want to recall." To remember or to not remember. On the one hand, child survivor Robert Krell wrote about the fear of memory, which, he said, might unleash the demons of remembrance to haunt the already haunted. On the other hand, Judith Kestenberg, one of the true discoverers of child survivors, wrote that there was a hunger for memories, as if life depended on them. Memories make us feel alive, and with memories we triumph over death. So remembering is a balance between craving and terror, pain and numbness. How much memory we allow into awareness depends on how much pain we are prepared to tolerate. And that depends on how much hope we have of achieving meaning and purpose through remembering. You might have now gleaned that remembering is not an all or nothing affair. Child survivor Dory Lau, been to Melbourne actually, pointed out that there were degrees of remembering and forgetting. At an extreme, it may seem that we don't remember at all. But then we may relive events in dreams, or fugue states, or body symptoms. Or we may enact memories in behaviour, and especially in children in play and drawing. Memories may reach awareness in undigested physical, psychological, or behavioural fragments. And finally, there may be revelations and integrations of memory into ever more coherent mental pictures, words, and narratives. So memories reflect the complexity of our minds. They may be overwhelming or absent. They may be mixes of words and silence, thinkable and unthinkable, aware and unaware. They range differentially across our bodies, minds, societies, from survival needs to existential meanings. And which specific type of memory is remembered, where, how, when, and to what degree, depends on what is judged to serve maximum survival at that time. Let me give you a non-Holocaust example of what can happen in traumas. In 1983, Ash Wednesday bushfires, our Mount Macedon team observed that after a few days, the local residents inundated their jeepies with a huge variety of symptoms, such as palpitations, nausea, stomach cramps, and so on. But unawares, these symptoms symbolised untenable conflicts for them, like, why did they not help their deceased neighbours? How could they have wept themselves, like babies? Reinterpreting these existential dilemmas in realistic terms helped to resolve symptoms. For Holocaust survivors, it's much more complex. For instance, the question often arises as to whether memories represent true reality. Traumatic memories do actually represent reality to the extent that the reality is revealed, which may not be total. Differences in memories of people who underwent the same traumatic situation are due to the different people having different survival issues in the same situation. I will show later, for instance, how my parents and I had true, but very different memories and very different degrees of memories to the same situation. Overall, Holocaust memories are especially valuable, I think, to civilization because, as in no other situation, they include every possible traumatic situation, and memories are extensively recorded across the generations. So now let us look at these memories across the generations. I will refer to each generation. First, adults. They are people, let's say, more than the age of 15. I know that there's adolescents, but for the sake of simplicity, let's call people survivors beyond the age of 15 as adults, because they had similar memories to adults. Immediately after the war, survivors exchanged information about the war, like who survived and who not. They told each other their experiences to variable degrees. A few wrote books, more wrote letter-type memoirs of a few pages. But soon survival issues took over. Many married other survivors and quickly had children to replace possibly the dead ones. They got lost in work and building up security. In the 1960s, the Germans offered compensations for certain Holocaust sufferings. Survivors now had to plumb their memories and tell them to psychiatrists. And it was only during this process that some psychiatrists recognised for the first time the extent of physical, psychological and social consequences of the Holocaust. But then two types of doubt arose with respect to survivors' memories. The first was once again doubt as to their veracities. In this case, the criteria for restitution were very stringent, and had to be corroborated by witnesses, which actually in real life was impossible. So survivors got together and made up stories that corroborated each other. It's not that they exaggerated their sufferings, and they have even diminished them. But many Germans saw it their duty to expose the inevitable inconsistencies and to discredit the claimants. The other doubt arose about survivors' memories was actually that survivors, because they blanked out their most traumatic memories, often could not relate a coherent story. And even to their children, over years, survivors often conveyed their stories non-sequentially, non-verbally, evoking emotions and behaviour consistent with survivors' experiences. For instance, the hope fueled with a sacred innuendo such as never again. But their messages were enveloped in black holes where memory was obscure to significant degrees. Memory is not just remembering and suppressing sensual traumatic events like through sight, sound, touch, smell and taste. Memory extends to interpretations of events, for instance, according to moral judgments like guilt and shame, sense of injustice, and meanings. So, for instance, a mother who could not save her child suppressed her guilt, her shame, and being a moral failure without value as a human not fit to live. So though outwardly survivors worked hard to re-establish families and security, they were nevertheless plagued by different types and different degrees of remembering, often manifested in nightmares and wordless fragments of these memories, like in their bodies and mental attitudes and social interactions. Suppression of memories carried costs. Holocaust survivors suffered higher morbidity and mortality rates from a variety of physical, mental and social illnesses, more than the rest of the population, including even soldiers who had fought in wars. Nevertheless, after around 40 years, survivors had a surge of remembering. They were stimulated not only by the requirements of compensation, but also by the fact that they had achieved meaning in their lives through occupational success, having children and grandchildren, the existence of Israel. In a sense, they had defeated Hitler. This coincided with a time of optimism around the world following the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the world was more willing to listen to survivors. So here was a chance at last to speak of murdered families and communities and survivors' own suffering. At that time, hundreds of books and tens of thousands of testimonies followed. There was hope that victims' stories were engraved forever and that they would prevent the world from ever again experiencing the likes of the Holocaust. And still, even today, with regard to adult survivors, Holocaust memories may plague them. For some, the pandemic, with its threat, forced isolation and police patrolling the streets, evoked past terrors. Holocaust memories have also resurfaced among survivors in residential care as they were re-experiencing helplessness and they had time to think. Some had needs to tell their memories for the first time before they died. But this could lead to confusion in and even a sense of rejection by the children so far protected from such memories. So to this day, the dilemma of remembering and forgetting remains. I will talk about child survivors of the Holocaust in their second generation. So now child survivors of the Holocaust. Child survivors of the Holocaust were defined as children under the age of 15 at the end of the war. They were actually the most vulnerable and traumatised and killed group of the Holocaust. Yet, they were the last to be recognised in the 1980s, about 40 years after the Holocaust. The funny thing is, not only were they not recognised by others, but they did not even recognise themselves. And there were three special problems that added to this. First, memories of early childhood occur only in flashbacks, bodily sensations and emotions, without context and capacity to understand their sources. For instance, Litty, head of the Sydney Child Survivor Group, tells the story, so I'm allowed to tell it, of how she had recurrent images of falling backward into a sea of shit. She believed that these images indicated an innate mental aberration until she visited Theresienstadt, where she actually was interned as a very young child, which revealed latrines exactly like her images. Second, after the age of 7, when children remember like adults, they suppress their memories for fear of being overwhelmed by them, just like adults do, so children could imitate adults. But third, child survivors had a particular problem, and that was with their parents, because they often actually invalidated their children's memories. They said things like, "You can't remember, you know nothing, you were too small." They could not conceive, nor did they want to believe, that their children suffered as much or even more, sometimes, than they had. I'll give you an example, personal. My mother related numerous times to her friends in front of me how, when she and my father were led away by the Hungarian police to be put on the train to Auschwitz, they left me, and I was left alone in the street. This is how she related it. She said, "I was freed of tension at last. I had the best sleep of my life." And she would add how in prison she cohorted with thieves and prostitutes. And then my parents escaped from the train bound for Auschwitz. Refinding me and our subsequent survival was her dominant, heroic story. But what about me? My mother had no concept of what it was like for me at the age of 4 to be left alone in the street and to hear repeatedly over the years thereafter what a good night's sleep she had, having, as I saw it, abandoned me to my fate. So this relates to what I said earlier about how even in the same situation, people might have very, very different memories. For me, being abandoned at the age of 4 had all three ingredients that erased memory or made it difficult. First of all, it was too traumatic to recall, because I was too young to put it into context and significance, and my parents implied that only they had a memory of the event, so it seemed as if I didn't. Even now, actually, I often hear, "Oh, you were," just by ordinary people, they assumed that I could not remember because I was so young. And I assumed that that was true. However, one day, in the lift at a trauma conference, a grey-haired lady, who turned out to be Sarah Moskowitz, one of 2 women who discovered child survivors, she asked me, "Are you coming to my seminar on child survivors of the Holocaust?" I didn't know. I said, "I'm going to somewhere else." But she said, but are you a child survivor?" No, my parents are Holocaust survivors." I really said this. She said, when and where were you during the war? Oh, I was in Budapest during 1942 and 5. You're a child survivor, she said. Come to my seminar. I did. And I discovered child survivors of the Holocaust like myself. It was an amazing discovery, I can tell you. 2 years later, I met 1,300 child survivors of the Holocaust at another conference, this time in New York. I had a privilege to deliver a keynote address there. But the most important part of that conference for me was to be recognised by these masses of people, to share a deep common language that I did not know was there. And through that language and through verbal and non-verbal communications, to have the feeling to belong to a community to which we all belong. It's not that prior to this I did not know intellectually that I had been through the Holocaust. I did also know that I gravitated towards other children who had been in the Holocaust, but I could not give it emotional weight. I just knew it at the back of my mind. To recognise one's traumatic self, to put one's memories and black holes into context, may be actually a long journey. For instance, it took me years to just formulate the question of, well, why, when my parents were led away by the police, why did my parents not look around and wave to me? The answer came only more years later, and it was that, hey, had they done so, I might have run after them. So simple words that answered years of unconscious anguish. Over the years, our child survivors group in this very building heard, explored, supported, and made sense of each other's memories. Many of us embarked on personal journeys to our wartime environments. At different times, I personally visited Slovakia and Budapest with different members of my family, with my wife and each of my children. The last time included Julie, my youngest child, her husband, and their 2 children. I remember we all stood in front of the door to the flat where my parents and I had hidden during the war. Look, we had survived and thrived, I said. On the same trip, in Berlin this time, I estimated where Hitler's last bunker had been, and I stamped on it triumphantly. But my real victory has been to use my experience of trauma to help other traumatised people and to attempt to systematise trauma's complexities. So in my writings I described an octave of survival strategies which radiated 3-dimensionally across time, society and moral dilemmas. So there's the older generation of child survivors, now the second generation. Children of survivors, who were the second generation, were only discovered in the 1970s, still ahead of child survivors. Children of survivors had no direct experience of the Holocaust and therefore no memories of it. From their parents' perspective, their children, growing up in peaceful, prosperous Australia, endowed with the results of their parents' hard work, should have been happy. But such parental expectations were also bound up with the opposite, silent expectations. For instance, for survivor parents' children to marry early and have children like they had done, and to make up for the losses of family. Another silent expectation was for children to actually maintain full knowledge of the Holocaust and carry its memories into the future, because otherwise the Holocaust would be forgotten. All the deaths would be for nothing, for no meaning. And then, of course, the parents were not models for happiness. They oozed of the Holocaust. To remember or to not remember had very deep resonances in second-generation Holocaust survivors. Though they were expected to be happy, from birth on, they absorbed feelings, images, sensations, behaviour that their parents carried in their beings. The second generation said that they carried scars, but they did not know the wounds. It was as if they should remember something, but they couldn't. At other times, parental wounds were so much part of them that they did not recognise them as unusual. Sometimes they even felt that they themselves had survived the Holocaust, or that they, in a way, had drunk it in their mother's milk. For instance, a woman had panic attacks each time she drove past chimneys in an industrial part of Melbourne. It took her a long time to realise that they were connected to her mother's horror of the chimneys in Auschwitz, where she had lost her parents. Another woman had a panic attack passing through an Australian spa town. She believed that dogs would spring out from the houses she was passing. She learned later that her father's family was herded onto a truck by dogs in a similar village. Also, children were often named after the dead and were given roles of the dead, such as to care for their parents as their parents would. But roles might include a range of lost family members, as well as perpetrators. And in the latter cases, parents have said, "You are worse than Hitler. You are finishing what Hitler could not." So we see that these children could be given concurrently opposite roles. Sometimes Holocaust children's tasks were actually divided between children, so that one child carried the Holocaust while the other carried the untainted future. And these children could grow up, again, with totally opposite memories of their parents, of their lives, and sometimes these siblings had to split their own relationships because they were so different and saw things so differently. Reciprocally, to parental needs of their children, the children had needs of their parents. But to find their parents and to be attuned to them, children needed to ferret out their parents' feelings, images, emotions, as well as their censorships. So paradoxically, it was in this confused Holocaust package that they felt most at home. But the trouble was that children could not assimilate or understand their at-homeness, what was transferred into them, nor to what they had already attuned themselves to. For instance, some were memorial candles for a dead child after whom they were named. They felt like a kind of memorial candle, not that they had the words for it, but they didn't know why. For second-generation survivors to understand and resolve their children's wounds, they had to understand and disentangle themselves from their parents' contradictory wishes for them. Sometimes parents did help, for instance by taking the children to the sites of their own persecution and grief. And reconciliation could occur until death. For instance, Juliet's father on his deathbed confessed his guilt to her for making a decision that led to Juliet's mother's death. And he felt eternal guilt towards Juliet. This explained father's distance that Juliet had felt over the years. But she said, "You did not kill Mother. You were not God. You couldn't have known." And she cried. And this dying father looked at her with the warmth he had not been able to provide till then. On the other hand, unresolved conflicts could last till the grave as well. For instance, a man refused to have a COVID vaccine, and that was despite his over-anxious and over-protective Holocaust survivor parents. And so we see that the ripples from the Holocaust were manifold, complex, intense and variable. For instance, some children hid their Jewishness and married out in order for their own children to be safe. Or on the other hand, children have tried to return to their parents what they had lost. For instance, by becoming religious, like their parents had been. Let me just mention the ripples of the Holocaust to the third generation. Grandchildren of survivors may continue to carry the original fears, griefs, body sensations, sometimes knowing their origins even less than their parents. On the other hand, they may have often fulfilled their grandparents' desires for survival and normality more than their parents. Because they were less entangled, the children were less entangled with these survivors than their parents had been, they may approach their survivor grandparents more innocently and ask questions that their parents never dared to ask or were prevented from asking. And similarly, survivors may tell their stories to their grandchildren more easily than to their children because survival was now assured. We could stop at this point because we have learned a lot about different generations and their remembrance of the Holocaust, their memories. But I think it may be worthwhile to pursue some mysteries that we have uncovered on the way. For instance, regarding memories. Where are the memories that we don't remember? The black holes, the wounds, the deep knowledge, exerting major, even if silent, influence. Well, Freud would have said that these memories are in the unconscious. But what is the unconscious? Where is the unconscious? You may push away memories of murdered relatives, but you can't ever forget them either. But you don't think or remember them. Where is this knowledge of them while the knowledge of them is pushed out of awareness? So there's some basic mystery about us humans which has been there for 2,000 years at least, because the ancient Greeks already divined and said, know thyself, in the belief that it was hard to know thyself. But that was inscribed in the temple of Apollo, and to which Pythagoras added, then, if you know thyself, then thou shalt know the universe and God. But how shall we know ourselves when we are hidden somewhere from ourselves? A long time ago now, as a medical student dissecting the human body, I was confronted by the brain. And what fascinated me is that there was these two halves, hemispheres of the brain, and they were almost totally separated from each other. Now, the function of the left half was clear. It was the site of language, time, logic, analytical thinking and reason. But when I asked my teachers, well, about this slightly larger right hemisphere, I was told that it was the silent hemisphere. And it was. But we've come a long way since. Yes, the right hemisphere is silent in the sense that it is wordless, thoughtless, timeless, and self-unaware. So it doesn't declare itself to us. And like my teachers, we have not known about it. However, we now know that this hemisphere, in a way, is even the dominant hemisphere. It certainly communicates non-verbally through emotions, postures and behaviour, and formulates intuitive and holistic views of the world, which range from immediate survival needs such as fight and flight to existential beliefs including ideologies and religions. In normal situations, the division of these hemispheres is a very clever evolutionary ploy because it allows appreciation of opposites at the same time, such as thought and emotion, logic and intuition, analytic and holistic thinking. But relevant to our discussion, the hemispheres have also engaged in an opposite evolutionary ploy to not put things together, but to separate, to hide in the right hemisphere, for instance, untenable traumatic knowledge. And indeed, Roger Sperry, the Nobel laureate for his work on the hemisphere, said, "Information about traumas is lodged in the right hemisphere, where it seems to lie entirely outside the realm of awareness of the left self-aware hemisphere. Nevertheless, although seemingly lost, these memories and attached feelings can continue to influence whole brain functioning in subtle as well as profound ways. And recent, for instance, MRI studies have confirmed, for instance, that when reliving traumas, the right hemisphere is activated while the left hemisphere is suppressed." So what is in this right hemisphere? This is the black hole of memory. This is where the not known started. Where did it start to not know? The black hole of memory often started with the horror itself. So prisoners denied the significance of the chimneys in Auschwitz, even when only meters away from them. Another concentration camp survivor said, "I saw children carried by Nazi soldiers to the pit and dropping them into the pit. At the time I didn't want to believe that what I was seeing. I hid that in my memory." And when recalling unforgettable traumas, paradoxically, they are remembered as they were perceived at the time. So if this person remembers, should they remember a concentration camp, they would remember it as they experienced it at the time, not as we would think it appeared to a rational person. So they remembered the same perceptions, the emotions, and their suppression as it was at the time, with eternal inscription and eternal unreality. Not remembering unforgettable events contributed to survivors' confusion about their most traumatic experiences. So, for instance, when asked by lawyers about them, they could not give a clear story. Though survivors worked hard to re-establish families and security, suppression of trauma, let's say that unknowing of the trauma, carried costs. And remember that trauma also was not always totally suppressed, that survivors were plagued by different right brain leaks of remembering, for instance, through their bodies, their mental attitudes and social interactions, leading to what I mentioned before, to high morbidity and mortality rates. Holocaust victims said, "Remember us. Tell the world what happened to us." The implication was that telling the world, logically, verbally, the world will take note and learn something, mainly not to repeat its mistakes. As remembering the Holocaust prevented similar traumas. Well, the Holocaust has drawn attention to many things, like human rights and rights of the child, and they are enshrined in the United Nations declarations. And importantly, especially for traumatologists, the Holocaust was an important template for recognition and understanding other traumas in many other fields, such as in, like the bushfires I mentioned, in other disasters, in combat and in sexual abuse of children. But so far, the Holocaust has not been able to answer the never again plea. There have been other genocides, wars, and we are arguably again on the brink of an unnecessarily irrational threat, even bigger than before, to the world. So, have we learned nothing from the Holocaust as far as repetition? Perhaps not much from the left brain, where it says remember us, because the world doesn't necessarily remember us. And even if it remembered us, it's more concerned with its own stories in the current time. On the other hand, perhaps the right brain exposition of the Holocaust may give some clues as to how to learn existentially, not historically this time, from the Holocaust, and through that existential learning, learn not to repeat it. So right brain knowledge teaches us that traumas actually can be passed from the right brain to the right brain down the generations, as we have seen. They can also be passed horizontally, right brain to right brain, across societies, from leaders to their followers. And in societies that are undergoing traumas, traumatized leaders may arise and offer irrational right brain solutions to their traumatized people. Hitler was traumatized in his youth and took over when Germany's traumas could not be solved by other leaders. His right brain view of the world led to World War II and its tragedies, and the same for other irrational leaders. The power of unrecognised trauma may be made most manifest today, maybe. My right brain is talking now to you. In the US, which may be seen as progressing, like lemmings, to external or even civil war. But again, this irrational force may hide something traumatic, some traumatic situation which the leaders and the followers are not totally aware of and are not able to solve. So, for instance, hidden behind apparent wealth of America, while the number of billionaires is exploding, poverty is also increasing. A significant proportion, a sixth to a quarter, of American children, and in the poorer areas and states, the proportions are much higher. A significant proportion of US children don't have enough to eat, and in the poor states the proportions are higher. So millions, especially in these poorer states who previously were maybe born again Christians, are now waiting for their religious salvation, now believe in a messianic right hemisphere Trump as their saviour. Right brains have inherited old means of survival, such as conquest and annihilation of enemies. Physical and mental borders divided us and them. These means were adaptive in poor environments, but in our current world, where traumatic situations actually have solutions, cycles of trauma are really not necessary, nor are they rational. Indeed, we have to remember and understand traumas, our own, but others as well. For instance, while confronting China over Taiwan, which could lead to a catastrophe, it would do as well for us to remember previous traumas, like the century-long trauma that China experienced, together with exploitation and humiliation of their people by European powers, including America. And this America, from thousands of miles away, is still supporting Taiwan, just like it did at the time of the Chinese Revolution. It would do well to consider that situation from the Chinese point of view. I'm not saying that Chinese people are any more innocent than anybody else, like the Americans, but just simply using another part of one's brain in a way, trying to bring things together from traumatic past to the present. From a Chinese point of view, it would seem rather strange to have, what was their country, now a little island, thousands of miles away from America, and America wanting to go to war over it. There's some kind of, and that really resonates with the fact that America had actually occupied a lot of China itself. I don't want to appear simplistic or partial or idealistic, but it is conceivable that the irrationality of the Holocaust is manifested in similar irrationalities with similar reasons even in our world today. And if that irrationality can be understood in the right brain, the emotional, deep right brain, as well as the left brain fashion, then we may actually enhance rationality. Maybe even a little, maybe a lot, maybe at least a little. And in that case, it may then be conceivable that American poverty will be solved, that a solution will be reached over Taiwan, that food can be distributed to hungry children, and that peace can be achieved. To maintain peace, we were told to love thy enemies as thyself. It would be more useful to say, understand traumas, your own, but also your enemies. And finally, we are our memories, and our memories can stay in the darkness of the past, or we can use these memories to be the light for our future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. A lifetime of learning has been imparted to us in the best possible way, so we're extremely privileged for that. This is a moment now for any questions you might have that have come up. There's been a lot of things discussed here today, touching people at every level, survivors, child survivors, second gen, third gen. It's not like a group therapy session. It's just an opportunity to share a thought that has occurred to you as you listened to Paul today, and something that you might want to share. So Alison's got the microphone if anybody would like to perhaps share something with us. Gentleman at the back there. And if you could keep the question to a few minutes would be grateful.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture, which I enjoyed very much. Thank you. The question I have is the question of insecurities in the offspring of child survivors. As an example, my daughter, who recently, a few years ago, went to Israel as a tourist, came back and told me, you know what, Dad, this is the first time I've really felt completely safe. So my question is, can that feeling that we had as survivors pass on to our offspring in a way that only involves, as you were saying, the right hemisphere of the brain?
Israel, of course, was meant to be the answer to the Holocaust. Yes, so Israel, of course, was meant to be the answer to the Holocaust. The degree of security while living in Israel varies a lot, actually. I mean, some people feel secure, and why? Because, you know, like I felt at home amongst the 1,300 child survivors. We can also feel at home with the 5 million Jews. And deep down you can have the resonances with the population that you might not have in Australia. And that could give a sense of security. And that is the hope, that Israel will provide a sense of security. But there are problems because, you know, I was connected with the 6-Day War in Israel. I certainly didn't feel secure. For you were surrounded by enemies. Certainly things are changing, but overall, people would always talk about what is the situation, you know, meaning what is the survival situation. So certainly that is one way that adults, child survivors and second generation and third generation have tried to deal with their sense of insecurity and maybe succeeded, and to various degrees, and maybe not succeeded to other degrees. To actually believe, you know, that Israel is the ultimate solution is a right brain statement to oneself. This obviously has left brain real situational truths, like people can feel there, at least not be persecuted like they were in Europe. But there are resonances of other traumas, like the Arabs' traumas, that they had to suffer because, the way they see it anyway, because of Israel, and these tensions and near wars, revolutions and intifadas are still a threat. So to completely see it from our own, I'll say our own because I was also there in Israel searching for the same securities, to be totally involved in our own right brain search for security and not look at others' similar search for security does have problems.
Have we got a question?
scientific validity is there in the frequently mentioned genetic changes that are brought about in second and third generation by the trauma of the original survivors? Is there in fact a genetic change, or is it a question of right and left brain functioning and not genetic?
Yeah, it's a question where I'm certainly not an expert. I certainly think that in the main, the right-left brain explains a lot. There is recent research on what you mentioned, sort of genetic cellular changes as a result of stress. In other words, that environment can be inherited. It sort of may ring true. You might say that, well, instead of drinking it in your blood, you actually inherited it in your genes. I think that's very early days to think that way. But I would say that the Holocaust is actually transferred almost like in the genes, in the sense that all the way from the brain down to the cellular levels, the physiology evoked by all types of physiology, the nervous system, the parasympathetic, the stress hormones, they all have an effect all the way from the brain to the cells. And in that sense, what you're saying also doesn't make sense. The Holocaust is transferred in the body as well as in the mind and society.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Paul. I wanted to ask you, do you think the fact that we brought our Holocaust memories to the fore in the child survivors group, that was better than having it suppressed?
Well, like I said in the talk, that's the eternal question, okay? Because remembering has costs and not remembering has costs. You can't say, some people never came, once they saw what the child survivors were doing in remembering, they left. Others benefited and said, well, it's the best thing that ever happened to me, that I was able to remember what I've been suppressing, and all the costs of the suppression are now ameliorated.
How much a question? The gentleman at the back, Alex?
Oh, sorry. I'll see that. I'll be there next.
Can't hear down here. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah, why don't you go to someone else and then come back? We'll come back. Yeah, we'll come back. Come back.
There's a question in
You
the
have one
front.
over here as well?
You mentioned that it's there's value in acknowledging that China's national trauma as a result of American occupation. Do you think there's practical applications to recognizing countries' national trauma that could change the path of geopolitical conflicts, or is it just so infinitely complicated that it's impossible to actually make a practical outcome that would give us wisdom to better solutions?
Basically, I don't have the answer. Um, but my sense is that if, as against what we hear these days, which is seeing China as aggressive, and that we have to do everything to defend ourselves, and you know, some kind of domino theory that if we let go of Taiwan, then goodness knows what, you know, how far the Chinese will go. It doesn't necessarily help. It may help, and I don't see this being promulgated, at least in the papers that I read, that there's not a recognition of history and what emotional impact that such history might have on a people. We don't hear say, well, sorry for what we've done, and we'll compensate you for what we've done, you know, like the Germans have done. There's no such concept that we understand what, including America, has done to China over, it was a long time, it was 100 years that they were in. Well, the British as well, yeah, but they were, I was talking about America, so I was talking about American conflict current, but there were American concessions there as well. It wasn't just British, it was all the West. So there isn't a kind of rapprochement of understanding which would mean some kind of recognition of one's own infliction of trauma and needing to be sorrowful about it, show that kind of sorrow. I'm reminded like a little bit the Aborigines here. Instead of that, there is an armament, you know, building of warships and so on, in case this country will take revenge on us, or will just simply do what we did, which is to expand into the world as far as we could. So I think understanding this underlying dynamic, it's difficult because it means that we, the Western countries, would have to acknowledge guilt, and it would also mean for the Chinese to have to accept that they were really badly done by and traumatised, and they had to cop it. That's how it is. Those were the facts, and you can grieve it. You can, yeah. But to try to overcome it by yourself being a conqueror is not going to serve the world very well.
Thank you. We've got one, Mary.
Hi Paul, thank you for your very moving and informative address. I just want to bring it back to the personal for the Holocaust survivors and say, you as a child survivor, me as a second generation, the survivors here, how do you see and what message have you got going forward for the museum and life in the future for the preservation of the Holocaust memories and the work of the museum?
Thank you, Mary.
I talked a lot about the right hemisphere of the brain. I think the museum represents the left hemisphere of the brain, and both halves are very important. So to actually remember the whole brain, I think the Holocaust Museum is very important, and the care that is taken here to verify every piece of evidence, I think is very important. It's very important to say, well, this actually happened, you know, this is the history. What you make of the history and the emotions that it evokes and how relevant the history may be to today, the information feeds into the right brain, but ultimately the two have to work together.
Thank you, Paul. That was very illuminating and moving talk. The question I have is about perpetrators, and it's to do with, presumably there are repressed memories in perpetrators, memories that go into the black holes, as you say. And I was wondering what work, if any, there's been on how that affects future generations. In other words, what's transmitted from that into future generations. And the reason I ask that is that presumably that's important when future generations are trying to reconcile, like many of us are trying to do, for example, with our First Nations people. So I was wondering if there's any work being done in that area.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, because you could make the argument that you learn more, actually, about violence from perpetrators than from their victims. There's a problem that victims or survivors have a kind of moral license to talk if they want to. It's hard enough for them to talk, but at least when they talk, morally they are innocent. If perpetrators talk, morally they are guilty, so they tend not to. They tend to obfuscate their guilt to themselves, and, just like just like the victims try to obfuscate their pain, but perpetrators have it much worse, in the sense that if they say what they did, they would be prosecuted, maybe put in jail, or hanged, who knows. Nevertheless, I think they are very important. I have written a book on perpetrators, if you want to buy it there. Ultimately, we have to, what I said was, try to understand yourself and your enemies as well, okay? Without understanding the enemies, there's a lot of information lacking. What is the saving grace? And it goes very much against the grain, because you hate your enemies and you hate your perpetrators, and you wish them dead and wish them away and never to see them again. But actually it's there that the information lies. And what is the saving grace about that is that ultimately they were also often, and I was thinking the same of the Germans, victims. And it took a lot of effort actually to make a concentration camp guard or one of the heads of them. Germany was a traumatized nation before it started its atrocities. And to understand, I know that this is very difficult, but to go beyond the evil that they perpetrated, to go and ask, well, why? What was the situation that makes an ordinary human being murder? And there's a lot of information about that. Maybe not in terms of major societies, but certainly individuals. If you look at a murderer, there are reasons from the murderer's point of view why they did it, and they would consider themselves the victims of the situation.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you. We have a question here.
Excuse me, referencing both America and China and a little bit of what you've just said, has Germany's admittance of its guilt helped survivors in any way or not?
I think it has. I think it. So if they had not admitted the guilt, it would be worse, because the guilty people would still be going around maybe blaming the Jews for whatever. And it's happening. I mean, there are Germans who do blame the Jews. You know, there are such movements around the world. But to admit it, and for the government of Germany to come down on these deniers of the Holocaust and blaming the Jews for whatever they did, and they're still blaming them, I think it helps to allocate the roles of perpetrator and victim. And Germany's done it, you could say, in an exemplary way. It would be good if other nations did the same.
Thank you. Rona? I've got these to wait.
Hi, just on behalf of my dad, who was wanting to get your views on the relevance of George Station to other genocides, like in Rwanda, and then maybe picking up on what you're saying about, you know, each nation, the perpetrators carrying some of the trauma. Like, how do you recognise it before it explodes?
Well, this is a tragedy that since the Holocaust there have been other genocides. Sorry.
Thank you.
So that is the tragedy that since the Holocaust there have been other genocides. The Urban Staub, who has written about these genocides, and he was the guy, just for interest, that when I was recognised as a child survivor at that San Francisco conference, he and I spent hours and hours talking about our experiences. He was the first person who I saw coming from Mars as another person like me. So he was in Budapest during the war as well. He was similar age and so on. Anyway, so so he was very interested in the Holocaust, and he thought that he could learn something from other genocides, and he did go to Rwanda, as it happens. And his conclusion was that there are similarities in all these situations, and it is often a perception that the other, be it the Tutsis in Rwanda, were actually out to kill the Hutus. No, this wasn't quite true at all, but you always, the perpetrators will always paint others as the perpetrators, as the potential perpetrators. So there was a cycle of, well, actually genocide. When the Tutsis eventually won, they didn't genocide the Hutus, but to this day there are still tensions there. Erwin Stab, who I've just mentioned, actually went to Rwanda and got different ethnic groups together to speak and try to find common ground. We had some success, just like there are groups between Arabs and Jews in Israel going on, and in Germany actually. But the success is limited and not necessarily accepted globally by all.
I have a practical question. Your expertise, where
that the services to provide to deal with transmitted traumas. Do you have any suggestions? Do we have anything in Melbourne? It used to be a Jewish care. 20 years ago, they organized a little group for youngsters, the youngest survivors, art therapy, but that was closed very quickly. Is there something, I don't know if you're still practicing yourself, so please.
I'm personally not aware of such groups. There may be, but I'm just not aware of them.
Any services?
Well, services there are. There's certainly services to Holocaust survivors, especially by Jewish care, or supposedly. I don't know. I'm sorry, it's not my area. I don't know.
Thank you. Is there any one last question, or are we done?
May I ask another question? I would like an explanation of how to understand the behaviour of certain perpetrators. For example, the officer in charge of a camp might have his children, his pets, his beloved wife, ensconced very comfortably in a home not far from the camp. Yet he'd go to the camp every day, see terrible things happening to punions, observe children being killed, dogs being set upon people all the time, and then he'd go home the same night, play with his children, play with his pets, and be a very kind, loving husband. How does one explain such a dichotomy?
It's a way of seeing the other in a dehumanized way. It's a bit like you can kick an animal and cuddle a baby at the same time. You can eliminate Aborigines while you still love your children and give them work for them and want to give them land. It's a very good question, of course, but it's a way of, it's a sort of almost universal way. You know, we see now on television all kinds of atrocities, and we know about them, but we carry on loving our spouses and our children. It's a human way of trying to survive and not get involved in others' traumas. And if you're causing traumas, we rationalise it as saying, well, they are not like us, they are not humans like us. The Germans went to great trouble about that, to make sure that Jews were dehumanised.
Just got one last question, Margaret.
One little question. Let's suppose we have a survivor and perpetrator. And, for example, perpetrator is not present, or John said, well, we're not perpetrators, let's say. What about survivor? Is it compulsory that survivor would search for others who may be perpetrator, who actually the person who is not, or people who are not? But is it a need for survivor to find someone to blame and behave like they communicate with the perpetrator?
Yeah, that's again a good question, because we're talking about cycles of violence, which certainly do occur. There are many examples of that. You know, for instance, you have psychological wars between certain countries, traditional enemies, and they always, the reason they go to war is to revenge the last war. With regard to Jews, which is a very touchy subject, isn't it? Um, we could say that, when Herzl went to Israel and saw it as a very suitable country for Jews, he didn't see the Arabs. And you could rationalise and say they were nomads, they didn't actually live there. You could say from your right brain, well, this is our country because biblically we were here 2,000 years ago. But that has as much rationale as when I was told by a schoolmate back in Slovakia that I killed Jesus. As if what happened in the last 2,000 years actually didn't matter. So there is a general tendency in humans to try to avenge their humiliation, their deaths, and so on. In the jungle, that was probably fine. That's the way to survive. In civilization, it doesn't work because you just get cycles of violence forever.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you. I think a big round of applause for Paul. I'd say that today's conversations and topics, if they've raised anything that's troubling for you, I do hope that you are able to reach out to somebody to speak to them tomorrow or however you want to, not to carry these things with you. If you go onto the Melbourne Holocaust Museum's website, under Explore, you'll find a category for child survivors of the Holocaust. And you can go onto that. There's really interesting papers to read. There's a lot of all sorts. There's also many, many copies of our Connections newsletter. I think you may find some of those answers, but if you are troubled in any way, then please just email me, Harry, in the museum. I'll give you my email address, and I hope to be able to direct you to be able to talk to somebody appropriate. Please don't hold on to these things that concern you after today. But I do think that it was very important for us to bring out all these topics that we hold so closely. I'm second gen. I do understand them from many different levels because I've been with the child survivors for 20 years. So Paul does have some books there. Perpetrator's got a bit of a ration, so you will find his book on perpetrators there. Others on child survivors of the Holocaust with test cases and answers and summaries. So I hope you'll now have a cup of tea, stay for a few minutes, unwind and have a good chat. Thank you so much.